Hi, everyone. This is Dr. Luke Johnson. Today, Dr. Jonathan Cook is back to talk Jack London with us. We're going to be discussing his South Sea Tales, and I'm looking forward to this. I finished the book just in time for this conversation. I had a few hours today, Dr. Cook, to do a little background research to see, who else had discussed this book, what do they have to say, some analysis.
Yeah,
There's
nothing.
very, very, very little, next to nothing about this text on the internet. In fact, I went to the Wikipedia page and it was blank for all the short stories. So, Dr. Cook's going to have a lot to teach us today, and this will be a worthwhile contribution to the internet concerning this text. And I was telling Dr. Cook earlier, this is really the first time I'd been introduced to Jack London was this year, and this was one of those authors that really had a lot of impact on me. I made a little top 10 list of my favorite books of the year, and two Jack London efforts made it into that list. So I've enjoyed him immensely. And yeah, I mean, why don't we get started? What made you choose this text to discuss today, Dr. Cook?
Yeah, so South Sea Tales, London wrote more than this one collection of 8 stories about the Pacific and traveling around the Pacific, which he knew from sailing in the Snark, his ship that he built in San Francisco, or rather Oakland, and then went out from about 1907 to 1910 or so. But the South Sea Tales are show a real mastery of understanding the kind of contact zone between Europeans and Americans and native peoples there. He's writing from the perspective of the early 20th century, although some of the stories, I think the whale's tooth goes back a little earlier. But he's talking about this important relationship between the colonial powers of England, France, to some extent Germany, and the U.S., mainly England and France, and these native peoples whose islands are pretty much dominated by, Western traders, and the things that are valuable from these islands, starting with, coconuts, is they made the coconut meat into something called copra, which is what you press to get coconut oil out of, but there's also the coconut meat. And there's something called bêche de mer, which is also called the sea cucumber, which is a high protein, kind of weird-looking fish that was valued by the Chinese. And there was also sandalwood and pearls. So various products that Western traders would get from these islands. And, they often would recruit natives to work on large so-called plantations, especially, big copra plantations or bêche de mer plantations, agricultural products. So they would recruit, sometimes going around, there's a term called blackbirding, which was recruiting laborers to work on these Western plantations. And this shows up in the stories several times, stories about, getting these labor recruits and how they're treated. So, it's a fascinating portrait of life in the Pacific over 100 years ago or more. It's kind of, London started out as a writer from San Francisco, went up to the Klondike and wrote a bunch of stories in the late 19th century, early 20th century about the Klondike and the gold rush up there, and contact between whites and Indians taking place in that setting. And so when he went to the Pacific, it's another realm that he mastered by his own experience of traveling it and talking to people and reading about it, because he was sailing around for roughly 3 years, starting out in Hawaii, and then going westward. You know, he went to Tahiti, he went to the Marquesa Islands, he went to the further west to the Solomon Islands and all around there. And, you know, one thing, when you read these stories, there are a lot of geographical references to obscure Pacific islands, which it really gives, it's useful to have Google Maps ready there and just type in the name of the island and find out where it is, because he's really going all over the Pacific here, the South Pacific, to talk about these cultures. And, you know, there's an important classification you have to make between, you know, Polynesia and Melanesia. You know, Polynesian peoples are sort of brown-skinned, and they are, you know, they represent a specific ethnic group. If you go to Melanesia, you know, in the Solomons or the Samoa, well, maybe not Samoa, but Fiji, you know, these are dark-skinned people, and they, you know, almost look African in some ways. So there's a very different culture between the eastern part of the South Pacific and the western part near Australia. And London deals with both sides, both peoples. You know, because he ranges around. He has stories that are set in French Polynesia, also in the Solomon Islands, which I think were dominated by English traders at that point. Of course, you know, Australia was not too far away, and they, you know, all trade would sort of go in that direction. So you know, they're really fascinating sociological, historical studies about this so-called contact zone of whites and natives. You know, both hostile and friendly. You know, often some of these stories are incredibly violent, and that you get a sense of just the savagery really on both sides, but more on the European side, you know, punishing some of the people who tried to you know, overrun these ships that are going on for trade to get a hold of some weapons or some tobacco. You know, there's often a medium of exchange is tobacco sticks that was very common at the time, and that shows up in these stories. So, you know, these are wonderful stories. They're well plotted. They form a coherent unit about these experiences, and they really teach you a lot about colonialism and imperialism in, you know, kind of a major phase in the early 20th century, when, you know, the peak of the British Empire, obviously.
So, what motivated your interest in this? Was it in part stirred by the dearth of resources on the internet, or what's the research material out there in the print world or in the scholarly literature like for?
Well,
for
there's
this
not
text?
much at all. I mean, London wrote over 200 short stories and in you know, over a dozen collections. And you know, in high school, sometimes you read To Build a Fire. That's the best known of his stories, or maybe you read a couple of other stories, Klondike stories, but you really don't get an exposure to just the wealth of narratives that he produced throughout his life that are just, you know, a lot of people consider the short story his greatest genre. You know, I could, you know, we could dispute that if we want. You know, his nonfiction is brilliant. He has a limited number of novels. Well, more novels than you realize, but
Considering his age.
yeah. But you know, most people consider him not to be primarily a novelist. He's mainly a you know, short story writer or an autobiographer. Even though he did produce, you know, at least one really good novel, or great novel, at Martin Eden. So, you know, I like the fact that you can learn about him as a short story writer with this focus on a particular part of the world, with this collection, and from the early 20th century, and they're very, you know, they really grab you in terms of characterization, in terms of conveying the sort of violence, brutality, and the beauty of this part of the world. I mean, having, read Melville, his two nonfiction books are kind of semi-fictional books about this part of the world. One set in the Marquesa, the other in Tahiti, Taipei and Omu. It builds up a fascination. You get a fascination about these people and their cultures. Generally very positive. But this world also allured Robert Louis Stevenson, and we've talked about the Ebb Tide, that wonderful story. And Stevenson produced a nonfiction collection called In the South Seas, and also various stories about living in Samoa. So there's a whole tradition in English literature set in this part of the world, and it's worth looking into.
So this probably be a good time to enumerate the different stories that are in South Sea Tales, and maybe we can say a little bit about them as well.
Yeah. So we'll just go through. So there are 8 stories. So the House of Mapui, the Whale's Tooth, Mauki, Ya, the Heathen, the Terrible Solomons, the Inevitable White Man, and the Seed of McCoy. So the House of Mapui is a wonderful story that is about a native in the French Polynesia. The name has changed, but they call it Pomatu, and he desires to have a house built from a very beautiful, huge pearl that he's found. And it's about how he has to give up the pearl to a trader because he owes him a debt. But then the pearl ends up in the hands of a German Jew named Levi. But then there's a huge hurricane, and it gives you a very vivid sense about the incredible force of this hurricane. Of course, we call it a typhoon, I guess, or some kind of, has a different name. Hurricanes are usually for the Atlantic. So it's a wonderful story about how he gets this house after all, the loss of the pearl and the obtaining of it again after his mother is blown out to sea and washes up and then finds the body of this German trader who has the pearl in his pocket. So very bizarre, but still plausible story about a huge tropical storm. The Whale Tooth is a grisly kind of black comedy about a missionary, John Starhurst, who decides he's in Fiji. He's going to go up the river and missionize a very remote part of that part of the world, and he doesn't realize that this chief where he's living, has a hankering for his boots, and he sends a whale tooth after him without telling him to offer to any chief who will do his bidding. And of course, his bidding is to have the guy killed, and then his boots given to him. So Starhurst, reaches this tribe where the agent comes and from the guy who's carrying the tooth gives it to the chief, and the chief has to do this other guy's bidding. So the missionary is killed. Offering himself up kind of as a martyr, saying, why are you doing this? I'm only trying to help you. So a black comedy about the missionary effort in Fiji, which of course is famous for cannibalism. Of course, John Starhurst is going to be eaten by these people after they chop his legs off, his feet off to get the boots. Mauki is about one of these contract laborers, a young man who is living on Maletai in the Solomons, and he is being oppressed, but then he's picked up to do contract labor on these plantations, and it's about his multiple escapes and escapades, and then finally his work as a laborer under this sadistic German named Max Bunster, who brutalizes him every day, and then eventually Mauki is able to take advantage of this guy when he's sick and dispose of him, and then return to his island later on with all of his prizes, and he ends up a chief himself with several wives after this life of contract labor. Ya 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 is about a Scotsman who says that ya 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 when he is effectuating the massacre of these native peoples, because he is part of a trading outfit that is dealing in contract labor, and when they try to get his ship, he escapes and then comes back with 3 ships into this place where these natives have tried to take over his ship, and they're brutally punished. And it's about the hold that this guy has 20 years later as an older man over these native peoples who are terrorized because of his violence towards them. And they've been completely dominated by this guy because of his ruthlessness. The Heathen is about a dedication of a Polynesian man to the narrator Charlie, who benefits from his friendship. And indeed, the guy, the so-called heathen, a non-Christian, in a community where many of these native peoples have been baptized and become Christian, his dedication to his friend Charlie, that he dies for, through saving him from being killed by a shark. Terrible Solomons is a comic story about an Englishman who goes to who's on a ship and is with a captain who decides to play a practical joke on him because this fellow Bertie Arkwright almost kills him because he tells him the gun he has is not loaded. And then it turns out to be loaded, and the captain shoots it off to show him that he didn't know anything about revolver. So he decides to play a practical joke on him, and the rest of the story is about that. Inevitable White Man is about a story about this American who has an impeccable shot. He's really kind of not talented at anything except he can shoot, with deadly aim. And he's part of the narrator is telling how he is part of a group on a ship 20 years previous where they were saved by him when natives tried to take over their boat. And this guy shot someone who was about to kill the narrator, and then was a deadly shot with all these other natives. And the term inevitable white man kind of applies to the idea that whites, you can't get away from the white race in the Pacific because they visit the islands, they trade, they dominate. And, these native peoples just have to deal with it. They didn't ask for this, they just have to accept their fate. Last of all, the Seed of McCoy. It plays on the famous story of the mutiny on the Bounty, which took place in 1789, where Captain Bligh was the victim of a mutiny of his crew and one of his officers, and he was put out in a ship with some other sailors, and he survived a journey. And the mutineers went to Pitcairn Island, and eventually ended up killing each other, mostly out of petty squabbles about women and other disputes. So this guy McCoy is the grandchild of an original McCoy who was part of the mutiny and who died by suicide after he had become a victim of delirium tremens. So this guy McCoy, the story takes place, of course, at the present time. It's about how McCoy saves the ship of a Captain McAllister and his mate who are carrying a cargo of wheat that's starting to burn in the hold. So this guy McCoy gets on the ship at Pitcairn Island, and he says they can't land there. What they want to do is land and try to salvage the ship somehow, or else get off the ship where there's civilization. But he helps them sail it west to another island after several days of wandering around and bad weather. He helps them navigate into an island and bed the ship on a sand beach area or shoal so they can get off the ship where there's people and survive. So the interesting literary connection here is how someone as rotten as the original McCoy, the grandfather, has produced a grandson who turns out to be a very incredibly philanthropic guide to this ship. And you're not really sure during this voyage, because this McCoy has a very pleasant temperament, and he's very soothing and charismatic, and not really sure if he's helping them sail this ship in a terrible direction to screw them up, or whether he's actually trying to help them. Well, it turns out he's a real mensch, as they say, and just saves the ship. So those are the 8 stories. They all have different moods. Yeah.
I was going to ask what your favorites were. Before we got on camera, I mentioned that I enjoyed the last 2.
Yeah, The Inevitable. Yeah.
I thought this is the first time I've ever talked about it. I thought there were sort of ideological similarities with Kipling, with The Inevitable White Man, with White Man's Burden.
Right.
So that's part of the. So that jumped out at me for that reason, and then I really thought, at least with the McCoy story, that was the style of London that I had come to enjoy in the other books that I rank so highly. So that's why stylistically I preferred that one.
Yeah.
To The Inevitable White Man, but it seemed there was some sort of kinship between Kipling and London in that story. Those were the two. Those are the reasons why I like those 2. What about you?
Well, it's interesting you're saying connecting it with Kipling, because London read Kipling. He liked Kipling. He learned a lot from Kipling. Kipling was the great English short story writer in the late 19th century who was writing about empire and colonialism. The Inevitable White Man, interesting though, has an American subject. So the white man is not a European colonialist. He's a dead shot American. Which kind of draws on the old cowboy sort of cliche about Americans and their ability to shoot. But Seda McCoy made me think of that great Conrad story, Youth, where he's on a ship where the cargo of coal is on fire, and he's going to I think he's on the way to Singapore. And it's the same kind of long, drawn-out story about a disastrous voyage. Seda McCoy has a lot of sort of nautical information in it, which reminds me of Conrad. But it also, it's adventure like Conrad, but it tells you, it's sort of an interesting take on the history of colonialism and the fact that, these original mutineers for the bounty were bad apples, and here this grandson is a hero and a saint almost. So it's kind of the sort of moral transformation that has happened, and because the narrator, McCoy, openly admits that his grandfather was a scoundrel and died a horrible death. But I mean, to tell you the truth, I love each of them because there's great ironic twists. Like the first one, the ironic twist about how this poor trader, Maupui, this native, who is there, all he wants is a house with a nice clock and 4 rooms around the center. Kind of middle class aspiration that he wants. This guy who really has nothing there on this this very remote atoll, and how he ends up, winning the jackpot. Well, his mother helps him do it. The whale tooth, grisly comic story about the futility of missionizing in that in some parts of the South Seas, and the fact that yes, there were cannibals in that area. Fiji was famous for cannibalism. Missionaries were killed and eaten, and other people were killed and eaten. So there's an ironic twist there. Mauki has the ironic twist of how he gets away from Max Bunster. He's tortured, he's victimized. There's a terrible description of this guy Max creating a mitten out of the skin of a shark that he scrapes across this guy's back or arms, to punish him, and like repeatedly, and how Mauki manages to do the same. And that's very brilliantly illustrative of the violence of colonialism. The fact that these white people would come back and just wipe out these native cultures and chop down their palm trees, and in this case infect them with smallpox to kill them off. Kind of reminds me of a passage in chapter in Type B of Melville when he talks about Admiral Porter, who early in the 19th century wiped out the Taipei peoples, as retaliation for something they have done. I love the humor of the Terrible Solomons, because you're not really sure what's going on, and then you realize the whole thing is a practical joke. The Heathen, I have to say, it's one of those London stories where you feel you almost want to cry at the end because of the noble dedication of the friend to Charlie. Kind of reminds me of the end of White Fang, that wonderful dog story that followed. Is actually a better story, I think, than Call of the Wild. White Fang is a wonderful novella about the dog from the Yukon who ends up in being taken on by a family in Oakland or in California. And so anyway, a kind of moving ending about absolute selfless devotion to someone, someone else. In this case, this native islander. So I really, all this is a roundabout way of saying I like them all. There's none of them that I just, kind of shrug after. I love the irony. I love the humor. I love the realism of the violence that takes place, and just tells it like it is, about the brutality that kept these peoples in line, and in some in some ways you understand it, because they, sometimes they're attacking these ships that are coming in because they just want to rob them, take advantage of them, kill them all off, chop their heads off, have their heads as a trophy in their house. So the Europeans come back and do the same, except they have the more firepower, so they totally destroy everything, versus the natives who, just kill some of the people.
Well, I had a feeling you were going to say that you love them all equally.
Yes.
Earlier you mentioned that it might serve the reader well to pull up Google Earth as they're reading these stories. I hadn't even thought about doing that, but I think that would, at the very least, there's a number of audiobook versions of these out there, but at the very least, someone could put together a pretty compelling slideshow for each of these. And like you said, are there any other ways that you think the modern readers should approach this? Tricks or techniques or gadgets or just a mindset, an attitude?
Well, I think the perfect way to do it is to listen to the stories. I mean, there is a recorded books version, and then if you're for each story, make sure you understand where it's taking place. You type in the names of the geographical locations, because it's amazing when you actually look at the huge expanse of the Pacific and these tiny islands like Pitcairn Island, way down there, kind of south east of Hawaii, right in the middle of nowhere. And then as you travel west, you go north, you get to the Marquesa Islands. You go west, eventually you get to French Polynesia, but there are all sorts of little atolls and islands all over there. And then you go farther west, you have all these island groups. And if you know the history of World War II, you know the names of some of these places. Like Guadalcanal is, but the geographical range is impressive. Because he is really, London is able to give a feel for all these different regions in the South Seas. French Polynesia, the English sector closer to Sydney, Pitcairn Island, of which, of course, is still, I think it's still under British possession, and lots of little atolls and lesser islands. So you're really going over a huge expanse of the Pacific when you're reading these stories. But
do you feel that some of these stories work better when they're listened to versus when they're read, or do you think London may have had that in mind, that he wanted some of these to be listened to and read aloud to people, or?
Well, I just think they have great drama, have great dramatic value. So reading them aloud, sometimes gets you sort of entranced by the actions of the stories, but doesn't matter too much whether you read them yourself or listen to them.
Something as far as we're talking about techniques, something I do, and it's not that revolutionary, but this might be important to anybody who's listening, is that many of the books that I read, I also recite and record simultaneously. And so I can listen back to them later and get a different experience. Because a lot of the books that I'm interested in, so you too, Dr. Cook, is that they don't exist in audio format. And then that way you can have both.
Yeah. Well, one thing about these stories is you really have to be nimble with your names, because you get a lot of foreign geographical locations. You get a lot of Polynesian names, Melanesian names. Each story you kind of have to make a little list of the people you're talking about from the beginning. The House of Mapui, because Mapui is the guy. Then he has a wife and a daughter and the mother, and each of them has a very unusual Polynesian name. And then you have these 3 traders who are coming there, and names of the ships as well. So you have to get used to memorizing the few names. Of course, that's true of any story, but particularly true of London. And it's amazing that he mastered all this information. I mean, he sailed around for 3 years. He read about it. He interacted with some of the colonial masters and the native people. So he really educated himself a lot about this part of the world, and some of the stories are partly based on his own experience, like the storm in the House of Mapui is probably grows out of when his early visit to the Solomons, when he went through an incredible tropical storm,
Was he writing was he writing these while he was doing his voyage, or was it many years after the fact?
No, he was producing. Well, to tell you the truth, he was writing Martin Eden when he was on these voyages. I think he was producing them here and there as he went along. When he hear a story, maybe say, "Oh, that really reminds me of something," and then he knocked the story off and then send it in, because he needed to make money, of course, so he would be feeding the American press as he was sailing around. And shipping stories and narrative back, and he, of course, he recorded this voyage in The Cruise of the Snark, a nonfiction book about this.
I have to read that with the Alice in Wonderland allusion.
Yeah.
Like That's just like a big glowing exclamation mark.
Yeah.
Please read me.
Yeah.
Well, that's interesting. So, were the South Sea Tales published all at once, or were they serialized
Well,
in
they came out as
different
a pub.
publications?
It came out individually and then as a book. That was how he usually worked.
Were they? Did they all come out like month after month, or
No, I
over?
think interspersed
Okay.
in this period.
So he could have done a couple of these and then released a novella and then gone
Yeah.
back to it. Okay.
Yeah, he was definitely mixing things up.
I didn't look at the timeline. I don't.
Well, he sailed to Hawaii and he spent actually several months in Hawaii, and he wrote stories about Hawaii, but we don't get them in this collection. These stories are mainly about, French Polynesia and the Solomons and Samoa and farther west than Hawaii. But some of his best known Pacific tales are about Hawaii too. Like there's a story about a leper and the leper colony in Hawaii. This is a selection of his South Sea tales that came out as a book and doesn't represent all that he wrote about this part of the world.
Yeah, it sounds like a complete reader on all his short stories would be a very valuable thing for the library.
Yeah, it's interesting. I was looking around, and there's no contemporary edition of his collected tales. There's some older ones.
Really?
But nothing.
That's surprising.
Yeah.
That's really surprising.
And the Library of America has his Klondike stories out, a selection of them. But his oeuvre is vast, and he really deserves a reading from people who like really good storytelling, and he's very contemporary for us because he has a great sympathy for the underdog and the oppressed, and he's living in a time of vast inequalities in the U.S. and vast dominance of the world by European and American powers. So he is out there chronicling all this contact on the front lines between the people with all the power and the native people who are the servants and factory workers and plantation workers who keep the imperialistic factory humming.
Yeah, and I guess it might be worth kind of elaborating on those themes and how the South Sea Tales connects to those currents that are going on in society.
Well, you read about this horrible plantation system where these workers were paid a pittance. I mean, it's kind of like the workers who were brought into Qatar, to work, contract workers coming from Pakistan to work in the Arab Emirates, who are basically there to send money back to their families, but they're paid poorly. They live in these, warehouses and dormitories, and so this was going on these plantations, these coconut plantations, and Mauki is a story that really illustrates the oppressive conditions of labor. Of course, he's trying to escape all the time, and every time he escapes, he's caught, and then he has to pay for his what he's done or what he's stolen with another year or two of service. So he just has years and years added to his contract labor until he finally, is stuck with this sadistic German overseer who, tortures him basically, and then he's able to escape from. So you really have a sense of how these people are preyed on by these European powers. They trade, but they also dominate the culture, and you also have an idea about the influence of religion. The missionizing impulse. Of course, the whale tooth is the focus of that particular theme about how these missionaries were sometimes the the sort of cutting edge of the Western imperialistic enterprise. John Starhurst, the minister of the whale tooth, is, he's sort of a two-dimensional character, but he represents, the kind of diehard missionary who believes totally in the the value of bringing Christianity to these native peoples. And of course, when Starhurst talks to this chief, he reads him the story in Genesis, and the chief tells him, I can't believe that story. God made the earth in 6 days. I know, when I build something, it takes weeks and weeks of labor to do it. So this native chief is offering a kind of deconstructive attitude towards the creation story in Genesis. And so you can sympathize with the chief who says, well, why should I buy into your view of the world, because this is the world I know. And Starhurst, of course, gives up his life to because of his idealism to bring the truth to these natives. And of course, he is kind of a fool because he had total faith in this guy that he was converting, who he said he would convert as soon as his wife died. He couldn't be a Christian in the beginning because he had several wives, and he's promising that he will become a Christian soon. But he's the one who sends up the message, sends up the whale's tooth to the chief saying, kill this guy and then give me his boots because I really like his boots. So Starhurst is naive to totally trust these native peoples, but then, he's naive to be thinking that he can totally change their cultures with his gospel message.
So this leads to the question about whether or not London has fairly represented the Polynesian, the Melanesian in the novel, or in the short stories.
Short stories, yeah.
Yeah. What's your take on that?
Well, London, he has sympathy for the underdog. I mean, he's a white European. He has a little bit of racial pride, as someone who was born as an illegitimate son of a astrologer and a woman from a sort of middle class life who fled Ohio for San Francisco for something more interesting. He has a little bit of Anglo-Saxon pride in him, but it doesn't. He's not at all. By all means, he's not a racist, and he has the incredible ability to enter into sympathy with all of his characters, because all the Polynesians, they really come alive. You understand their point of view, their motivation, their behavior. He sees both sides of the picture, and which is what he has to do as a writer. That's what a writer. He doesn't want to present. He's not presenting something. But Kipling is sometimes accused of being, well, Kipling is kind of the same in that his sympathies extend to all peoples, but later Kipling became more imperialistic and defensive of white dominance. London never got into that position, never became that way.
This might be a little bit of a tangent, but you mentioned that Jack London has an astrology background.
Well, his father, Jack London was the name of his stepfather, that is mother, Flora Wellman. She came from a sort of upper middle class family in Ohio, and had an education. She played the piano. She gave piano lessons, but she had this affair with a guy who was living in her rooming house in San Francisco, who when she told him she was pregnant, he says, "I'm out of here. You either have an abortion or I leave." So he left, and she was abandoned basically, and then was married by Jack London's stepfather, John London, who was a Union veteran, and he farmed, but the family was very poor, and then he died. He was a bit older than Flora Wellman, and died when Jack was still pretty young.
So you're saying that Jack's real father was the astrologer?
Yes, his real father. Yes, but he didn't have any contact with him. Although late in life, like I think in the 1890s, towards the end of the 1890s, he tried to contact his father. His father wrote back and said, I don't know if I'm really your father, because your mother had a bunch of boyfriends, and I think he was trying to, shirk off the idea that he had any responsibility towards Jack London. So Jack London, needless to say, is very disappointed by that, and but it didn't dissuade him or anyone else from thinking that was indeed, his father.
Reminds me of a movie that I saw recently, Ryan O'Neal and Paper Moon. Have you ever seen that?
No, I never saw it.
Yeah, no. So, some of those themes are addressed there. It was pretty good. So, I mean, throughout our conversation, you've peppered in some comparisons with Melville and Stevenson and Conrad. Are there some major parallels that have yet to be addressed there? I mean, we've covered we've covered a lot of ground here. But
I think each of them. I mean, Stevenson. Well, each of Melville, Stevenson, Conrad. Part of their work was like Conrad. They didn't specialize in narratives from that part of the world, but they all of them had experience of sailing around that area and then writing about it. And in Stevenson's case, he ended up living there and dying there in Samoa in the early 1890s. Conrad, not so much the South Seas, but you see an understanding of imperialism, say an outpost of progress, African imperialism, these two guys who were there to just to collect ivory tusks and end up killing each other because of their isolation. Sympathy for native people and understanding of the imperialist project. Conrad is brilliant in that respect, and London as well. So all of them are showing, the contact between these native peoples and the Europeans. Stevenson, when I think of the ebb tide, that amazing character at the very end who they were, these rogue Englishmen are set to rob, and he turns out to be kind of a religious kook who dominates in the end. It's kind of the opposite of what happens in The Whale Tooth. But it's interesting touching on the story of missionizing in the Pacific, which Melville was all about. He totally understood this phenomenon, criticizing the missionary effort because of its detrimental effect on the natives. We don't see that much in London, but the Whale Tooth shows the naivete of the missionary effort of taking place in Fiji, which was, of course, the area most famous for cannibalism. So you could make comparisons between different stories or chapters of these other writers. Kipling, of course, did not write about the South Seas because he never went there, but he talks about English imperialism in India and also stories of England and America that touch on the same themes, same kinds of themes about native peoples and their colonial masters.
So where do you think these stories fit into the Jack London canon? Well,
Well,
I'm
it's a
like, what?
cluster.
Yeah, I mean, maybe they're just kind of lost in the fold with all the other short stories,
Well,
and that's why there's so little on it. But it,
I
yeah,
think they stand out. You know, the Klondike stories are well known. To Build a Fire is well known. This is another. If you want to get into his South Sea adventures, this is probably the place to start. Um, and So it's a good starting point for anyone who might have read Jack London in high school, at junior high school. The Call of the Wild, and they think, oh, he's a writer for young people. Well, that's ridiculous. You can still read A Call of the Wild as an adult and find it an amazing book. And
do you think do you think it's a success in those other books that perhaps overshadowed a lot of the things that we've talked about? Do you still think that applies to South Sea Tales, or do you
Well,
think there are other reasons?
I think, I mean, the thing about Jack London is the rest of the world loves London. I mean, he was famous in Russia. He was famous in Europe. He was a world-class writer in the beginning of the 20th century, and that continued for for a couple of decades. And by the mid 20th century, people kind of forgot a lot of his work and kind of pegged him as a kind of adventure writer for underage people, and just put him aside. I mean, there's really not that. You don't have many academic specialists on London these days. You have a few. I think their number's growing. You have several good biographies out there. So he's never been forgotten, but he's never been, adopted as a darling of academia the way some other writers have. In a way, people are afraid of him because they connect him with sort of, white supremacy and racial ideas at the beginning of the century, and eugenics and social Darwinism. London read up on that. He knew it. It shows up in a few places, but that's not who he represents. He overcame any idea that the white race is some superior race born to rule.
Yeah, Jack London has been unfairly canceled, it seems.
I think so. Definitely.
Yeah, I could see
because
I could see someone thinking it would be some kind of minefield and just be like, you know what, it's not worth teaching this, or it's not worth being a scholar in this, because I'm going to have to constantly defend it or explain it or contextualize it, and like, oh, just work with somebody modern. And that seems to be a great seems to be a great tragedy with literature and history and so many other things, is that it's potentially triggering and upsetting, and therefore, well, let's just exclude it or not take it seriously.
Of course, anyone who read these stories with an open mind would see that he has immense sympathy for, the oppressed. The oppressed.
Oh yeah, it just may not jibe with their 2022 sensibilities.
Yeah, yeah, that is an issue, and I think that's something that it will keep him out of the academic limelight to some extent. I mean, he's not really taught in literature. American literature surveys, you don't find Jack London there. I mean, of course, there's a lot of material to cover, but you don't really get his stories included. So he becomes kind of a cliche of a boys' writer that everyone they'll read. To Build a Fire or A Call of the Wild, and then that'll be it.
Yeah, well, you were really the only person who's ever really recommended him to me, and I'm glad you did. Like, it greatly enhanced my reading life.
Yeah. So,
I mean, I feel like we've kind of covered most of the material that we set out to cover today.
Yeah.
Unless there's anything.
Let me just throw in a little nugget at the end. I'm trying to make my way through as much of his stories as I can, and Jack London, he was an oyster pirate as a 15-year-old. He came from this very poor family, and he made money going out and stealing oysters from other people's oyster beds. And then he turned around and he became an expert sailor on San Francisco Bay. Turned around and joined the Fish Patrol to catch the oyster pirates and other people fishing in the bay that were using the wrong kind of nets or stealing from other people. So he wrote a set of stories called Tales of the Fish Patrol, which are hilarious. Actually, I think he put it out a little bit before these stories. So if you want to get another exposure to a group of stories based in one geographical area that's very familiar from people who live in San Francisco, Tales of the Fish Patrol. Wonderful stories, hilarious, most of them based on his own experience as a young man, teenager who was the pirate, and then he turned around and became the cop on the beat in the Fish Patrol. So I just wanted to put in that plug.
Yeah, I'll
for
have
that book as well.
I'll have to do a little background research on that. All right. Well, thanks, Dr. Cook. I
Okay.
appreciate you talking to us about these today, and we'll chat a little bit more about future endeavors.
Okay, good.
All right. Take care, everyone.